Welcome to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Professor Paul Youngbin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here is Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim.
Dr. David I. Smith is Professor of Education at Calvin University, Director of the Kuyers Institute for Christian Teaching and Learning, Calvin University, Coordinator of the Vries Institute for Global Faculty Development, Calvin University, and Senior Editor of the International Journal of Christianity and Education. David earned his BA in Modern Languages, German and Russian at Oxford University, a postgraduate certificate in education from the University of Nottingham, a Master of Philosophy in Philosophy of Education, Philosophical Theology from the Institute for Christian Studies, Toronto, and a Ph.D. in Education with a specialism in Curriculum Studies from the University of London. David has written widely and worked extensively with educators at all levels of education on questions of how faith relates to the practice of teaching. His book on Christian teaching was awarded the 2021 Lilly Fellows Program Book Award, biennial award for work focused on teaching and scholarship in the Christian intellectual tradition. David is a passionate listener to a wide variety of musical genres and enjoys gardening, woodworking, and reading outside of his work-related fields. David, thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
It's a pleasure to have you. As I read in the bio, you wear so many different hats professionally. You're doing a lot, and you're incredibly busy. For our listeners, could you give a brief overview of what you're involved in currently, especially related to your scholarship and service on teaching?
Sure. Well, I have three different jobs basically at Calvin. Maybe the easiest is to start with the smallest one, actually, which is I work for the Vries Institute part-time, which is a recent research institute at Calvin whose focus is faculty development for Christian faculty all around the world. So for a number of years, we've been developing an online learning platform called Reflecting Faith. I've been developing courses for that and also training faculty at other institutions to be leaders of those courses so that they can use them as a resource in their own faculty development. Those are built around various faith and learning themes. For the Kuyers Institute, which is our focus is faith and teaching, we actually just finished a project on civic hospitality. There's a website, civichospitality.com, with teaching resources for teaching around the problem of polarization. We're moving into a project where we're essentially taking the Reflecting Faith online learning materials from the Vries Institute, and we're creating a K-12 version of them. So creating distance learning resources for K-12 teachers around connecting faith and teaching. With my education professor hat on, I'm teaching a couple of courses this semester. They're new courses, so that's taking up an enormous amount of my time, but it's quite fun. And then the journal chugs away in the background. The journal editing is a year-round thing. So, and I'm just finishing up a book, which I've been working on through the year on the scholarship side. So yeah, so lots of things happening.
So impressive, and again, amazed that you're able to fit all of that in. I so appreciate the connection between the two institutes that you're a part of and how you're using materials from one for the other. And what a good way to sort of bring those two things together.
It helps when it all passes through the same brain.
Yes. And also, well, I know we'll talk about hospitality later on as well, but the idea that you're addressing something that's so timely, not only in our country, but also globally as well. You mentioned teaching and how that's really fun for you as a professor of education, and this podcast is focused on teaching as well. I'm curious if you could briefly talk about the classes that you're currently teaching now. You mentioned new classes, and maybe even give an example for one of those classes about how you integrate different themes like diversity, equity, inclusion, which is one of the focuses of this podcast, and Christian faith as well. Maybe an exercise or a posture that you take in those areas.
Sure. Yeah, I'm teaching two classes this semester. One of them is a brand new class that never existed before. It's going to be a required class in our education program, and it's called The Christian Teacher.
Wow.
So it's basically an attempt to spend a semester looking at what it means to be a Christian teacher and how faith relates to teaching, and that's been extremely fun and rewarding to try to figure out how to explore that with students in a way that comes alive, and also students who are going to teach in Christian schools and students who are going to teach in public schools. So that's taken up a large portion of my waking mental energy for the last 12 weeks. And my other course is one that did actually exist before, but it switched this semester from a 3-credit course to a 4-credit course, and the length of the class is changed, so like everything feels like it's got to be redesigned. So, and that's a class on world language pedagogy. So it's another education class, and it's for students who are going to be language teachers of Spanish, French, German, Chinese, Japanese, etc. Anybody who's going to teach a language in K-12 schools. As I say, that's one I've been teaching for many years, but it all had to be reconfigured and extra bits added and so on this semester. So that's been a design challenge this semester as well. I thought about your question about the diversity and equity and inclusion part. I mean, we could talk about either, but with the language pedagogy class, it might seem superficially as if that's like a really natural fit because we're learning to teach other people's languages. Right. But a couple of things that I end up talking to students about early in the semester. One is that a lot of the methodologies that have been developed over the last 100 years in the West for teaching languages don't pass what I called the Klingon test. So for the second Star Trek movie, a Klingon language was invented. And it has a grammar, it has a phonology. They hired a linguist and invented a functioning language. And now there are conventions you can go to. You can buy courses to learn Klingon. There's a Bible translation team, right? It's turned into a thing, right? And so you can actually go through language learning sequences learning Klingon if you're so inclined. But the thing is, there aren't actually any Klingons. So the whole thing's an entirely self-referential exercise. It's just moving things around in your head, but there are no actual human beings that it refers to. And it's surprising how many language learning methodologies don't pass the Klingon test, right? You can teach German in a way that doesn't require Germans to exist, as long as you treat it as an exercise in moving grammatical ciphers around or in making the right noises and getting grades. And then when we also look at course content in a lot of language courses, a lot of really sort of post-1980s language courses have had a very strong focus on consumer activities and the ability to navigate tourist landscapes and so on. So again, it turns out often that it looks like the reason I'm learning languages is so that I can navigate Germany when I go to Germany. And it's fairly self-referential. It's not because Germans are important. It's because I need German to get food when I'm in a railway station in Frankfurt. Right. So if we sort of take those two things and ask how we might want to resist them, this already starts to look forward to hospitality. I say, what if part of the reason we're learning languages is simply because there are people who speak them and we need to learn to open ourselves up to those people? We talk a lot about learning to speak a foreign language, but we very rarely talk about learning to hear a foreign language, as if the reason we're learning a language is just so we can bless more of the world with our opinion. So how does that then change the way we approach language learning? So a particular activity that I did a couple of weeks ago in that class was when we started thinking about where culture feeds into all of this. I come to class and give each student a small envelope, and the envelope contains a collection of stickers, all of the same color. For each student has a different color, and each student has a little card that gives them a cultural identity and a behavior to look out for. So the card might say something like, you're Cuban, and so you when you're talking to people, you tend to move towards them and get very physically close to them. So if you're talking to someone, try to move closer, and if they back away, keep moving closer, right? And so they have like a behavior to do, and they're also told if the other person doesn't cooperate with this behavior, so if the person keeps backing away from you, put a sticker on them, don't tell them why. And then another card might say you're German. Germans in conversation tend to make lots of very direct eye contact, whereas Anglo-Americans tend to glance away a lot when they're talking to people, and so try to maintain eye contact as constantly as you can bring yourself to do. And if you notice your partner glancing away, put a sticker on them. Don't tell them why, right? And so everyone's got a different one of these. And then I tell them, you're at a work reception, go chat about your weekend for 5 minutes and talk to at least 4 or 5 different people. And they all come out covered in stickers. And so it's basically a simulation of what happens in cross-cultural environments where you're making mistakes all the time. Nobody tells you the mistakes you're making. In fact, they might not be able to. They might not be able to identify them themselves. They just know that something's wrong. And it's not because anybody's trying to be mean. Right. It's not because people aren't nice, right? It's just because your systems of cultural behavior are not meshing with each other. And so then we actually try to guess what the mistakes were that got us covered in yellow stickers or red stickers or whatever. And most of the time it's difficult to guess. And so we debrief that, and we talk about what this illustrates about intercultural communication, and then we do it again, where they already know what the behaviors are. And they still get covered in stickers, which then lets us talk about how this is not the kind of thing you can turn on and off, right? It's not like after 50 odd years of being conditioned to behave like a British person, I'm going to suddenly be able to flip a switch and change the way my eye contact, my body language, my proxemics and so on work, right? It's just too ingrained. Even if I'm paying attention, I'm going to get it wrong most of the time. So it's also not the kind of thing where you can just say, well, people are in my space now, they should learn to behave the way I behave, right? So it doesn't work that way. So that's kind of a fun exercise to go through, because it makes it experiential rather than just talking about it as something that we ought to be concerned about.
Your example, David, reminded me of something that I do in my cross-cultural psych class, which is when we talk about stereotypes, I have students wear a stereotype like on their forehead or on their backs where they can't see what the stereotype is, but others can. And then others have to treat them according to that stereotype. And similarly, students sometimes are very puzzled about what stereotype they are. Other times they are able to guess, and sometimes, again, wrongly as to what their guess might be. But it's a good illustration of things like how our beliefs about people persevere, right? Like how we continue to treat people according to their stereotype, even if they tell you something otherwise, right? Or that we sometimes conform to a stereotype in a way that if other people treat us a certain way, right, we start to behave in that way as well. So yeah, I saw some connecting points between what I do and what you do.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you for that example. You mentioned hospitality. And across your works, you talk about Christian hospitality a lot, and you also mentioned civic hospitality at the beginning of our interview today. I love this idea. So for our listeners, if you could define it briefly and then give an example or two, and how something like this would be so important, a critical component of not only a cross-culturally or multiculturally focused classroom, but across classrooms in general.
Yeah, it's something I've been playing with for, I guess, several decades now. And one of the things that's really striking to me actually is over the last 30 years since I started reading about it, when I first started reading books about Christian hospitality, they were typically filed under Christian ethics. And it was sort of about the hospitality to the stranger texts in the Torah and sort of bringing that through into the New Testament. What seems to have gradually happened over the last 20, 30 years is it's been migrating into the center of Christian theology. So a number of the recent books about Christian hospitality are actually about Christology and soteriology, and are actually about God's embrace of us in Christ on the cross, and God making space for us, and so on, or things like Joshua Jipp's recent book Saved by Faith and Hospitality, tracing the theme of hospitality in some detail through the Gospels. So there seems to have been a theme that a while back people were thinking of more as kind of a piece of Christian ethics, and there seems to be a growing realization that it's part of the structure of Christian theology. And yet in the Christian tradition, hospitality is not an unambiguously good thing. So there's often a contrast made with hospitality as we often experience it naively can be a mechanism whereby I network with the people that I need to network with. I invite the boss around to dinner. I invite the bishop around to dinner. I invite the people who I need to be connected with around for a meal, and then I put on the nicest meal I possibly can and try to impress them with my cooking skills, and I make my house spotless and beautiful before they come. And hospitality actually becomes kind of a power play. And it's a way of bolstering my own importance in the eyes of others. It's a way of showing off. It's a way of securing the power of my networks, and so on. And right from the beginning, there's resistance to that in Christian articulations of hospitality. So all the way back to like the founding hospitality story, if you like, is Abraham at his tent with the three strangers arrive, and he goes rushing up to greet them and goes and sacrifices the calf and so on. And this has resonated in major ways through the whole Christian tradition. But in that text, he constantly talks as if the really important people are the guests, right? He honors the guests. He stands off to one side. Jesus picks that up in Luke 14 and 15, where he says, when you exercise hospitality, don't go take the most important seat at the table. Don't invite the important people who can pay you back. There's this whole sort of inversion of like, no, invite people who won't bolster your status. And when you're a guest, don't bolster your own status. And then, of course, Hebrews says, don't forget to exercise hospitality towards strangers, for this whole notion of entertaining angels unawares. There's this strand through Christian treatments of hospitality where the guest turns out to be God, right, basically. And I think all of that's really important, because if we try to adopt hospitality language in diversity context, there's a real danger that it becomes another language of condescension. And I've heard it used this way. You can be in a certain context and hear, oh yes, we need to exercise Christian hospitality towards speakers of Spanish. well, now suddenly we is speakers of English, right? And we own the space, and we need to graciously open up a little bit of our space for these poor speakers of Spanish who need to come and sit at our beautiful meal, right? And it can kind of turn toxic and quite colonial very quickly. If we're going to use language of hospitality, it's quite important to dig back into the texture of that theologically and see how much of Christian talk about hospitality is actually an attempt to undermine that very dynamic, to say that no, being host doesn't make you more important than your guest. Right. It's not a way of showing your prowess or your generosity or what a wonderful, gracious person you are. It's a way of humbling yourself and honoring your guest as God's presence. And when you're in a guest situation, you don't make yourself important. So it's that seems to me to be quite an important part of the whole dynamic in terms of Christian theological treatments of hospitality. Now, if we bring that over into the classroom, I started here with ways of how this helped me think about language education, right? Why do we teach people German, French, Russian, etc.? Well, maybe because one of the basic things you need to learn as a human being is how to practice the right kind of hospitality towards people who are not you. And maybe learning their language is one of the ways you do that. Actually learning, and maybe, again, like I said, maybe that's not just learning to speak someone else's language so that you can say more things. Maybe it's also learning to hear the way other people speak. So it even shifts that emphasis that language learning might be, in significant measure, learning to hear new people and learning to make space for them in your own sense of self. But then we could also think more broadly about teaching and learning. You know, I've also, whenever I teach, I walk into a classroom. There's a space there for students. My students are diverse. They're not me. They're not each other. And so how does the classroom become a hospitable space? And again, that could be a condescending hospitality in which I just try to make the poor students feel safe while I browbeat them. Or it could be a much more cruciform kind of hospitality that really tries to serve the needs of the various different people present. I like to think in examples much more than precepts. And so if I could give an example from my other class this semester, my Christian teacher class, I always spend forever agonizing about what I'm going to do on the first day of the semester, because the first day is where you set the tone. And so what I tried, I'd not tried this exact thing before, what I tried in my Christian teacher class on the first day was I moved all the furniture into one big round table and we sat around it. And first I asked students to talk to the person next to them and just find out two things from that person that they were willing to have shared into the group. And then I had each person introduce their partner into the group. But after every second person, we paused and I quizzed the rest of the group on what they'd just heard. So after the first two people, they just had to remember two people's information. After 4 people, we had to remember 4 people's. After 18 people, we had to remember it. So it got more difficult as we went along. But after about 25 minutes, we all knew everybody's name and 2 pieces of identifying information about each person in the room. And I had students journal about it afterwards, and I was really struck by a couple of things. One was how many students mentioned the fact that I sat down with them in the circle, and how that immediately gave them the impression that I might be a human being and might not be too threatening. So the importance of physical posture. Right. But also how many of them talked about how even in those classes where the professor makes the effort to learn their name at the beginning of the semester, it's quite rare for professors to pay attention to whether they know each other. And so when they're asked to then work in pairs or work in groups, it's kind of weird because they don't know this person that they've just been asked to collaborate with on something. Right. And so just how that created a much more encouraging initial texture for the class, because they actually felt like other people knew who they were and they knew who other people were. And, for the investment of 20 minutes, we sort of got from zero to a space where everyone had achieved initial comfort, at least with everyone else. So, and again, students were just quite eloquent and quite explicit about noticing the difference that made to their ability to work together in the classroom space. So trying to think about the class in terms of hospitality, in terms of this kind of host-guest dynamic, that I'm the person who most gets to shape the space. But then how do I use that power? Right. And what kind of experience does that create for those who participate?
I'm taking notes as you're speaking, David, because there's so many great ideas, but also principles that you're underlying here. When you talk about literally sitting down in the circle with students, that's bringing your body into the classroom, that embodied learning space in a way that is so powerful and illustrates you, in some sense, giving up some of that power or recognizing that power and using it in the right way. So I really appreciated that part of it. And then also the idea that I think in your book you talk about the first 15 minutes of the semester being so critical that or the first 20 minutes, where instructors might not want to spend that time because they have so many other things to cover. But that sort of intentional and deliberate learning of names, but also important piece of information about each person is so important. And I appreciated that reminder. I know this is a very loaded question, and we could talk on and on about this, because in Christian higher ed we do talk about this, but we in Christian higher ed often talk about how, like, what makes Christian education distinctive and unique. And even those words, distinctive and unique, they can be very triggering for us in many different ways, right? But can you say a little bit about, like, what's helpful versus not helpful in thinking about Christian education in this way? How do you sort of define Christian education to someone who might ask about it, and maybe give an elevator pitch about what that might be? And again, I know that we're simplifying something that's very complicated, but how do you interact with those ideas and terminologies?
Yeah, I'm suspicious of the words distinctive and unique. Unique, I think, is very overused these days. People usually don't mean what the word means when they use it. Like, unique means once only, right? Distinctive is often used in a way that sounds to me as if people are trying to say unique, and then it also doesn't make much sense to me. So if we think about how identity works on a personal level, so distinctive is about distinguishing, right? It's about knowing, being able to tell the difference between you and the person who sits in the office next to you. That's what distinctiveness is about, being able to distinguish. Well, the way that distinctiveness actually works with people is not through uniqueness, by and large. So when I think about what's distinctive about me, what could I start naming? Well, I've got a British accent. That makes me somewhat distinctive on my campus, but it's also a feature that I share with 60 million other people who live in a small island just off Europe. Well, okay, so it's distinctive that I listen to a lot of progressive rock music. Well, but, when I go to concerts, there's a lot of other people who do that too. I've got a nose of a certain shape and size. Well, yeah, but so did my granddad, right? And what else? I like wood carving in my spare time. Well, so do a lot of other people in Grand Rapids. So it turns out that what sort of makes me identifiably David Smith is actually a configuration of lots of features, pretty much all of which are shared by large numbers of other people. It's not like I've got some body part that no other human being has got that you can look at and you can say, oh, this must be David Smith. He's got a triangle growing out of his left ear. When we think about Christian education, I think something like that holds. I don't think we're not going to invent some way of teaching that no other human being in the history of humankind could ever have thought of before. And then the next layer that makes it even more complicated is that Christianity has had huge influence on the development of Western culture. Right. And so there are a lot of things in terms of teaching and in terms of the wider culture that Christians have introduced for Christian reasons that have then become part of the wider culture. They're part of the way we do education. Well, should Christians stop thinking of those as Christian moves just because everybody else adopted them as well? Or are they still Christian moves, right? Just because, the ancient Greeks and Romans didn't really care very much about babies that they didn't want and left them out in hillsides, and Christians went and rescued them and adopted them. Well, now adoption is a thing, like everybody does it. So should we then think it's not a Christian practice to? So it just seems to me when we start from the question of what's different, we very quickly end up in very odd places. But I want to honor the impulse behind that, which is to say that Christian education shouldn't just be a replication of any other kind of education with a Bible verse and a devotion added. So there's this fascinating space that seems kind of complicated, right? Of how do we talk about identity in the midst of this? So my best stab so far, I'm not claiming to have solved this in any way, shape or form, but I like to talk about teaching practices as plausible extensions of Christian faith. So I'm looking for ways of teaching that are extensions of my basic convictions. So if I have basic convictions about hospitality, then I'm looking for ways of organizing my first day that are extensions of those convictions. I want them to be plausible extensions. I should be able to talk to other people about them, and they should be able to recognize what it is I'm trying to do. In other words, somebody else should be able to come and watch my first day of class and say, oh, I noticed you sat in the circle with the students. Why did you do that? And I should say, well, I was reading New Testament texts about humility and everybody being part of the body of Christ and all the parts being important. And that means I'm actually, like, I've got a different office right now as a professor from my students, but we're all part of the body of Christ, and I wanted to enact that. And then the person should be able to say, yeah, maybe that's a reasonable extension of the theology into your practices, right? So that's the process that I'm interested in. Now, Whether somebody else at Michigan State University might choose to sit down with their students at the start of class for different reasons, I don't care. That's not interesting to me. Like I'm not going into the process thinking I need to come up with something different or I need to come up with something the same. I'm going into the process thinking, how do I plausibly extend my convictions into my practices? And can I do that in a way that's defensible? Can I do that in a way that I can actually talk with my students about what I'm doing and they can look at it and go, oh yeah, I see, I guess, yeah, that sort of, that does look like a Christian kind of thing to do. If it's the same or different from something somebody else does, I really don't care. That interests me almost not at all. But what I have found over the years is that sometimes it leads me to very different places. I mean, just this last week, I gave assignments to my students. One of my students started their journal with the words, I started this week thinking about why Dr. Smith would give these assignments that no other teacher would have given. So we had so sometimes it leads me to some very unusual places, just trying to think through ways of being more consistent with where I'm starting from. And sometimes it leads me to things that lots of other people could do for different reasons. But as long as the connection can be defended and it really is an outworking, you think about it, work out your faith. Right. In fear and trembling, right? That it's how do we work out what's there? So I really think this whole idea of trying to start from the idea of difference is I just think it makes things really hard unnecessarily.
Right. And people use those terms so differently, and I love that phrase, plausible extension of my own Christian faith, and it challenges me as the instructor to also think about, like, am I able to provide an explanation as to why I'm doing what I'm doing? Or am I just maybe in some sense blindly replicating something that I learned from my mentors or read about in a pedagogical journal and not really critically thinking through how my faith connects to this, right? And how it's authentic to who I am as a Christian.
Yeah, it makes me think of something you said a minute ago made me think of another example, and it's in my mind because I've actually been emailing with the person recently because we're writing it up together. But several years ago, I'm not sure how many, 5-6 years ago, I had a student in one of my graduate curriculum classes, and she was from Nigeria, a school leader, and the first assignment, I asked my students to write a short bias autobiography. So what are the aspects of your identity that are going to make you a biased writer of curriculum? And when she started writing her piece, she wrote about how when the British came to Nigeria, I mean, to skip a lot of detail here, but they basically did violent things to her tribal group and sided with another ethnic group and so on. And that when she was sitting in my class for the first several days, all she could hear was the voice of the violent colonial oppressor because of my accent. And that she found it really hard to get past that and concentrate on what I was actually saying, so she hadn't actually been able to learn much in the class. And of course, my first reaction was complete panic and resentment and and so on, right? Sort of. But that wasn't me. I wasn't even there. How dare she? And I went through all of the kind of the human reactions. It's not my fault, but fortunately, this was a weekend. I had a little time to think about it. So now I've got to think about how to respond to this, and among other things, my theology should kick in. And so what I ended up deciding to do was on Monday morning, I took her aside at the start of the day. I thanked her for the journal, and I said, I really think, we've been talking in this class about the things that make curriculum difficult, right? What affects learning. It'd be really helpful if you could just take 10-15 minutes at the start of today to just stand up and explain to everyone else what the British did to your people in Nigeria and why that made it difficult for you to learn in this class. Would you be willing to do that? And she agreed. And then I intentionally went and sat down at the back of the room. I thought, I'm going to short circuit this whole thing now if I kind of hover over her in the background as like the authority figure who's still in charge of the room. I thought I need to not be in charge of the room at this point. So it was a very intentional stepping aside from power in that room and making space for a different voice. It was an intentional humility because I was the person being criticized at the front of the class. And it was intentionally focused on what might maximize learning for everybody else. And so I'm trying to process that in terms of, again, my Christian commitments to what kind of presence I should be in a group of people and how I should honor the other people in that group. And, there's no guarantee that this would be the case the next time, but on this occasion, she actually wrote back to me a few days later and said this actually cleared her mind. She was able to learn from that point forward in the class that the fact of being that I was willing to hear and acknowledge what she had to say and make space for it and let her say it to the others, it meant that I wasn't the same kind of British person that she associated with the past of her tribe. So this is the kind of thing that keeps me endlessly fascinated about teaching, right? It's this very complex dynamic. It's never just somebody passing on information. There's lots of really complex human stuff going on in any classroom. And my theology is one of the things that should shape how I think about inhabiting that human space. And again, it's not that no other person in the history of Western education has ever asked a student to stand up at the front of the class and share something they're bothered about, right? But in this instance, my Christian commitment was a very explicit part of my thinking about how I wanted to react to that situation.
Yeah. That's a really powerful example, and it strikes me that it is a risk-taking endeavor as well to be able to, as an instructor, be vulnerable in that sense and reach out to students. And then, like you mentioned, with no guarantee that the outcome will be positive, right? But also how rewarding it is when students are able to be receptive to that and learn from that. Going back to sort of the distinctiveness idea, I am also challenged by this notion that just because it's something that non-Christian instructors are doing shouldn't mean that we should stay away from that, right? Sometimes I hear this mentality that, we should really try to find something that's just us, right? And you're saying, no, that's not the right way to approach it, right? That there can be actually exercises or classroom content that's very similar to what a secular Christian classroom might be teaching, but it's the connection to my theology, my Christian faith that's critical. And when I hear that, I also hear then it's important for Christian faculty to be not like theologians, but theologically sound, right? That they have to have some level of theological training. And I know this is not a question that I had ahead of time, but David, I'm curious at Calvin or at other schools or institutions, do you see that where faculty are being given the adequate level of theological training? I mean, I have my own opinions about what I see, but I'm curious from your perspective, are faculty being trained enough to be able to have that plausible extension of Christian faith?
Yeah, that it's something we've been intentionally trying to address for the last 5 or 6 years, because we started to just sort of notice that as something that seemed to be eroding a little bit. That one of the things that I think has changed culturally over half a century or so is that being a committed Christian and going to a lively church doesn't guarantee you're being taught any theology at all. So if all you're really getting on Sunday is Jesus loves me, be nice to people, and a couple of jokes, then that's not really going to put you in a great place to try to integrate faith and learning at a university level. So there is a gap there for at least some people. I mean, again, some faculty come in with tons of theology, some come in with apparently really very little. So this takes me back to something I mentioned at the start. This is why with the De Vries Institute we started developing Reflecting Faith. The web address is reflecting.faith. And so far we've developed 9 online learning modules. They can be used online or they can be used face to face, which takes a particular theological idea. There's one on hospitality to the stranger. There's one on shalom. There's one on community. There's one on sin. There's one on image of God. And each course contains some direct interaction with Scripture and with theological and confessional texts, some reading in recent scholarship around that topic and its application to higher education, and some video case studies of faculty from different universities around the world, Christian faculty who are taking this topic and making it fruitful in some way in their teaching or research. We've had faculty from 40 countries through those courses already, but we're also using them on our own campus with our own faculty. We're using them to orient adjunct faculty, and we've also in other ways been kind of beefing up our new faculty development program over the last few years. So faculty now get a year-long seminar in their first year with a course release, and then in their second year a course release with a mentor and time to do some library work, and so that's much more than we used to do in the past. So we are very intentionally trying to invest in a much more robust orientation to the project of Christian higher education, not only in terms of theology, but in terms of thinking about teaching and learning, thinking about university mission, thinking about academic freedom, thinking about all of the the topics that cluster around being a Christian faculty member. But yeah, I do think this is increasingly important because it's the culture of many churches is such that they might not sustain a level of theological formation that might be fruitful for doing, postdoctoral level faith learning integration.
I totally agree. And so many of us come from graduate programs that didn't do any of this, right? So, I mean, you were gracious and said that some faculty come in with little theological background, but I remember outside of what I learned at Calvin, like faith integration was not something that was talked about in grad school. And so I came into SPU with just the basic understanding from what my experience was at Calvin, but not really having thought about it from a teacher's perspective. Yeah. Related to all these questions, you argue that Christian teaching goes beyond being kind to students and creating that often discussed space that we call safe space. This is something that comes up a lot in my classroom, which sometimes deals with very sensitive topics that students feel vulnerable about. And so this idea of creating that safe space is something that I introduce a lot and revisit a lot with students. I'm curious if I could hear your thoughts on that term and that idea of creating that safe space, especially from connection to Christian hospitality and whether it's sufficient to describe a Christian classroom.
Yeah, I don't think it's sufficient. I'm not sure anything is sufficient. Right. I think teaching's really complicated and Christianity is very rich, right? We're always going to be finding new connections. Yeah. So I'm not very eager to find the formula that fixes it all and makes me not have to think about it again. I mean, safety is quite important, but so we could run at this from a few different angles. If we think about the cross-cultural, the diversity inclusion side of it, right? I had a chat a few years back with some Indonesian students in graduate courses, and we were processing together why it was proving difficult for them to work in small groups with people in the graduate courses. And the conclusion we came to was that they had been socialized growing up in Indonesian culture into a behavior of not pushing yourself forward, that was kind of proud and aggressive, that when you're in a group setting, you sit quietly, you withdraw and you wait. And if you wait, someone will invite you to participate. Someone will invite you to take the lead, and then you will get to take charge and offer your leadership and so on. But you don't volunteer. Right. Whereas the Anglo-American students, growing up in their cultural context, have been socialized into a set of behaviors where if nothing's happening, you step up and you fill the silence. If nobody's taking charge, then you take the lead and you start organizing people so that something happens, because the non-negotiable in American culture is something always has to be happening, right? So you put those two groups of people together in a small group, and what happens is there's a painful silence, and the Indonesian students don't volunteer, and so the American students take charge and start organizing. And so the Indonesian students think the American students are terribly rude because they never give them a chance to lead, and the American students think the Indonesian students are terribly lazy because they never volunteer and take over tasks in the group. And it's not that anybody was trying to not be nice, right? Like everybody was trying to be nice within the terms of their own cultural system. So I think the first thing we have to do is to extend this notion of safety into a detailed understanding of the actual dynamics that are taking place. Like it can't just be about me having a nice, hospitable attitude towards my students, being a nice person, being an approachable instructor, right? I mean, those are all good things, but they're not going to actually get you very far if the actual practice dynamics are doing something else. And that might have nothing to do with the attitudes in our hearts. In one sense, it might be to do with the behaviors we've been socialized into, or the communication structures and so on. So that's the first expansion. If we're going to talk about safety, that has to be a discourse about the details of practice dynamics, not just an affective discourse, right? It can't just be about whether people feel safe and whether I feel like I'm a safe person. It's not about being nice. An example I used in the On Christian Teaching book, my son came home one day when he was in high school from a religion class, and he got homework, and he says, can you help me study? I've got this homework for religion. I've got a test on Friday. And he shows me a piece of paper, and he's got a list of 12 theological words on the left-hand side and 12 definitions on the right-hand side. Each word has justification, sanctification, kingdom of God, cultural mandate, Trinity, ascension, each one with a little paragraph defining what it is. And he says, would you help me study? So I sat down with him in the living room and started trying to ask him hard questions. So what's the difference between justification and sanctification? And how would you recognize either one if you found it in your lunch? And he tolerated this for 3 or 4 minutes before taking the piece of paper from me and tossing it down on the coffee table. And he said, but I don't need to understand it that well, because on the test, they're only going to make me match the words with the definitions. And he's not wrong. If the test is a matching test, you don't even need to understand the language the worksheet is written in, right? It could be in a language you've never seen before. And as long as you memorize the first 3 characters of each word and the first 3 characters of each definition, you'll be good. Right. You'll get 100%. So he's actually accurately analyzing the activity. Now, I don't think his teacher went into class that morning with a lesson plan that said, today I want to teach my students that theology doesn't matter. Right? This was a Christian teacher in a Christian school in a religion class. The worksheet is full of theology, but the takeaway for my son is I don't need to understand this. And this is the 12 words you need for reading the New Testament. Right? And that wasn't because some evil secularist teacher said, theology, don't bother yourself about that. And it wasn't because his teacher was mean and unsafe and so on. It was because of the structure of the information on the worksheet and the way that correlated with the common testing strategies in his experience of high school. So he's reading patterns in the design of the learning activities. And to me, that's another reason why we can't just talk about Christian teaching and learning as being just about ethos or just about atmosphere or just about niceness or attitudes, because part of what he's teaching is the practice patterns and the way students are reading those patterns and making meaning out of them. And that's why we've got to pay attention to the practice patterns. And that's also why, I don't want to start with the idea of difference. I also don't want to start with the idea of sameness. I don't want to make that assumption either. I don't want to assume that I can just take something from a secular school down the road and it'll be fine. In either case, the important thing is interrogating what the patterns mean. I don't care whether it's the same as what someone else does or whether it's different what someone else does. I care what it means. I care what story it's telling. Again, is it a plausible extension? So I can go on about this all day if you don't interrupt me. But you don't strike me as a very interrupting kind of person. Wave at me if I need to slow down.
This is great. No, I'm mesmerized by what you're sharing here because this is, to be honest, like something that I struggle with because I do really value coming across as quote unquote nice to students. This is something that, I think moving through my career and getting tenure, all of that kind of lessen that somewhat, right? But this is something that I continue to struggle with, as in like pleasing my students, and something that I consider to be a important feedback from students, that I'm coming across as nice in the classroom, and especially in classes where the content itself might not be as fascinating, like advanced research methods. I am intentional about coming across as extra gracious to students. But you're saying that while this might be part of the Christian ethos, it's not sufficient for the Christian classroom, and thinking about the intent versus the impact when it comes to our practices, right? That we might be intending one thing, but then like that example you gave of your son, the impact might be very different.
Right. Yeah, it's not a bad thing to be gracious. As Paul says, against these things there's no law, right? There's some basic virtues that there's no law against in any context, which is nothing actually. Being nice is also not a Christian distinctive in the sense of being something that nobody else can do, right? If I could throw in one more story, I had a conversation several years ago with a Calvin student who said, one of my professors started this semester, first day of class, talking about how our class is a temporary Christian learning community. And if we're going to be a Christian community, that means that each person here is valuable. Each of you are made in God's image. Each of you has been given gifts by God. So it's really important that each of you come to class every day, because each of you matter in this community. And the student said to me, she said, I found this kind of inspiring, because this is not usually the way class begins, right? Usually the first day is read the syllabus, exam dates, etc. This class started by talking about what kind of community we were going to be. And this was actually quite inspiring. And then she paused and she put her head on one side and she said, it took me 2 or 3 weeks to figure out that it wasn't really true. Because the way the class was taught, it made no difference whether I showed up or not. It was mostly lecture. As long as I borrowed somebody else's notes, I was fine. The exams were based on repeating what the professor said. So as long as I memorized the notes, I would do well on the exams. There was very little space for student input, and where there was student input, it didn't really make any difference to anything that happened. So in the end, it was just nice talk. And so this is why this idea of plausible extension is important to me, because if we want to use Christian words in public around a university or a school or whatever, that then makes us accountable for developing practices that are plausible extensions of those words. Otherwise, the words themselves start to ring hollow. Because they're really just a kind of a a kind of a side commentary or just a kind of a patter of noise alongside something we're doing that's not telling the same story. So this is another way of saying the same thing. Are we telling the same story with our words when we do chapel or when we talk theology or whatever that we're telling with our practices, when we design teaching, when we design course structures? And how to do that is not obvious, and it might even change a little from one group of students to another group of students because cultural context is a thing, and different students have different needs. So it's not like we can download one template from the New Testament that's going to tell us the right way to teach a research methods course. But I do have to be asking myself those questions about what story my practices are telling, what they mean in the context of learning.
You didn't use this word, but I thought about the word hypocrisy, that we often, I mean, that's a strong word to use for anyone, right? But when it comes to, like, again, saying something, but then not really designing the classroom in a way that meets those words, I feel like, that it's there, the students can see right through that, right? Especially this generation of students who are quick to pick up on those things. Yeah.
First thing I said to my students in my course on being a Christian teacher, I said, like, I'm teaching a course on being a Christian teacher. I said, what this course is an infinite opportunity for hypocrisy. So, they're supposed to be holding me accountable.
I have one question about your journal and then a couple of questions that I ask all guests. You're the editor of International Journal of Christianity and Education. That's a big role. And can you share briefly about your experience in being the editor of that journal, and especially related to how it informs your teaching? Because in your book on Christian teaching, you integrate a lot of the experiences you've had as the editor of that journal.
Yeah, I've been working with this journal for a number of decades now. It's an international journal. It's published by SAGE. It's fully peer-reviewed. It's in all the databases. We have a circulation of about 10,000 worldwide. And we've been really working over the last decade to make it a more genuinely global conversation. And we're getting more and more submissions from outside the West now, which has been really gratifying to see. And the sort of parameters of our journal, we don't just take papers from the discipline of education, and we don't just take social science papers. We take research papers that will help shed light on the intersection between Christianity and education. They could be historical, philosophical, empirical, theological. I don't care, as long as they're a rigorous kind of research in some discipline, but that is going to illuminate in some way how Christianity is intersecting with education. And again, education as a whole. It could be educational leadership, it could be teaching and learning, it could be learning disabilities, it could be diversity, etc. So we get some papers that are kind of like philosophical, how should we think about this kind of papers. We get historical studies of the development of Christian education in a particular place in India, or, there's just a whole range of different kinds of things. But we're really trying to increase the amount of scholarship to really make this whole conversation about Christianity and education not one that we just conduct in these big vague ideas like distinctively Christian and so on, but that we actually drill down and do research, right? It's what scholars are supposed to do, right? And actually try and figure out how it really works, and so do that in enough detail that we can actually move forward, that we can actually generate shared understanding around this. So I've always approached, I don't know about always, for a long time I've approached journal editing as a form of mentoring. So something that makes it both burdensome and rewarding is that I've always resisted the idea of like quick rejections, like three sentence rejection letters. Right. So we try to provide people with a lot of feedback on their papers because I see it as a form of mentoring. I want people to develop in their ability to write about this, and that makes it very time consuming. I spend a lot of time on the papers that don't get published, but I hope that's feeding back into people's capacity to actually address these questions in disciplined ways. And in ways that might actually hold water in a wider academic conversational context. So like I say, that's both rewarding and very time consuming. And people sometimes mistake us for a magazine and send me chapel talks and this kind of thing. And although even there, I'm trying to send back at least a few paragraphs on this is how this might need to develop. And the only ones I give fairly short answers to is if people didn't even read what our journal was about and just sent me some random paper about engineering or something. Right. But otherwise, we do try to treat it as an interaction process. And mostly people take that well. Occasionally, I get somebody offended because I expended so many words telling them what was wrong with their paper. But really, we're trying to give people constructive help on improving their work. And as I say, it's been rewarding to see it diversify over the last decade. It has a history. It came out of two other journals, the Journal of Education and Christian Belief in England, and the Journal of Christian Education in Australia. And about 15 years ago, we merged them and relaunched as this one international journal. And at the point of the merger, really most of our submissions were from America, Australia, England. And that's been probably the biggest change over the last 10 years is being able to draw a lot more people into the conversation, which has been really good.
Yeah, I've been following the journal recently, but I see how there's a global emphasis in a way that's very intentional, and I truly appreciate that aspect of it. And then also, your approach strikes me as, again, an extension of your Christian faith, which is not doing the typical sort of editor role of quick rejection, right, and minimal feedback, but actually taking time to see it as a mentoring process and giving detailed feedback. And that's very challenging to me as well as I review manuscripts. Okay, so here are a couple of questions I ask all guests. You mentioned your book, and I mean, to the degree that you're comfortable sharing, like, what is the sort of the exciting idea there? What's the most scintillating stuff that you're thinking about, maybe as a preview of some of the stuff that will come out of that book?
One of the seeds of the book I'm finishing up right now was a conversation I had with a group at Trinity Western University, actually, a few years back. I've been leading an online seminar around some of the things we've been talking about. And at the end of it, one faculty member said, I've been part of a church for years, and I've taught at a Christian university for years. And yet somehow I never would have made the connections between the two that you just made. How do I learn to think that way? And I thought that's a really fair question, because a lot of the books on faith and learning really seem to try to give you the dish but not the recipe, right? They tell you what you're supposed to think about Christian scholarship or the Christian mind. They give you creation, fall, redemption, or whatever. But they kind of, how do I get into the habits of thinking about the meaning of my practices in Christian ways? And of course, course content and ideas is another whole area that's a big literature that we haven't even talked about. I'm focusing here on teaching and learning. So I thought, I don't think you learn to think that way by sitting down and thinking about it really carefully and suddenly in a flash of inspiration getting this really clear mental model. Right? I think it comes through just repeated practice. So the book that I'm trying to write is one that, first of all, it starts from very everyday moments in teaching. So the sections of the book are about planning for class, the first day of class, giving out homework, pauses and silences, sequencing material, ending class, repeating things. It's just the basic dynamics of a semester. And for each of those topics, I've got 3 to 5 short, like 1,500 word narrative examples of, approaching that in a way that is faith tethered. So the story I told earlier about how I started my 249 class, that would be an example of an intentional way of starting class that's trying to get a certain set of values and commitments onto the table. So that would be an example of trying to narrate an example. And then there are reflective exercises after each one, asking people to think about, so what is it in here that's going on that's Christian? And can you think of another one like this that you could try? And could you go try it and ask your students what happened? And trying to, by the end of the book, you'll have done that 30 plus times. And so I'm hoping that people won't actually read it straight through, but will actually use it as a companion to a semester and kind of keep coming back to it. And just work into this habit of thinking about these basic teaching and learning moves as things that are tethered not just to utility or to pragmatic success, but also to the story that I'm trying to tell. So I completed a draft at the end of the summer. I'm now trying to turn it from a bad draft into a good draft, and I'm supposed to send it to Erdmann's in January. So that's still the aspiration.
But that's coming up. So. That I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And I love that phrase, faith tethered, as in my mind. Then I have the image of you keep coming back, right? When you're tethered to something, you keep return to, like, why are you doing what you're doing, and maybe even asking students to reflect on why they think I'm doing what I'm doing, right? I think that tethered is a very important terminology. The main listeners of this podcast are advanced graduate students and younger faculty. And I'm curious if you have just some advice for those who are just starting out their careers in Christian higher education.
Find a mentor. Find someone who cares about the things you want to care about. Make sure it's not the jaded person. Find someone who's still excited about this whole project of trying to think all this through and trying to figure out how to do it. And make sure you go for coffee with them at least once a month. I think an alternative is to, I often tell the same thing to teachers at the K-12 level as well, is find at least 3 people who really care about teaching and who really care about trying to grow into being a Christian teacher. which I think is a project, not something you arrive at after a month, and arrange to go out for coffee once a month or a beverage of your choice with a nice pastry in a congenial environment, and meet for an hour with a few ground rules. So no gossiping about students, no gossiping about colleagues, no complaining about pay and conditions, no talk about politics, right? The only thing you're going to talk about for an hour, and you're going to discipline yourselves on this, is what was the most fruitful and interesting thing that happened in my classroom in the last month? And why did it happen? And what do you think happened? Second, what was the worst thing that happened in your classroom in the last month? The moment when you thought, I'm really glad I'm not a student in this class. And why did it happen? What do you think was happening? What could you do about it? And then third, what's one thing you actually want to change in the next month? What's one small intervention that you want to try? One thing that you want to do to drag your practice a little closer to where you would like it to be. Because I think that one thing is quite important. If you try to, you can't reconstruct the entire car while you're driving it, right? If you try to change everything at once, you'll last a year before you burn out. But always having one thing that you're working on, and not letting the speed of the river just sweep you downstream, but always having one thing that you're working on that's a project.
I love that. I love the structure that you're outlining there, but not absent from the social interaction as well, right? Like having a good coffee and pastry, that's important.
The coffee and the cake are important ingredients.
That's critical, right? But also that we are using that time to really focus on teaching, because we are prone to vent about our students and our colleagues and our, like you mentioned, pay and our other working conditions, right? And so there's a time and place for that. But when it comes to this type of intentional mentoring, you're saying it's important that you have that structure.
Christians, education and gossip might be another whole topic.
Hospitable way of doing that, right? My last question, David, is something that can sometimes be really fun, or maybe something related to what you've shared, which is, without knowing who my next guest will be, and I can't think of them at the top of my head. If you could ask them any question, what might it be?
My selfish question would be, what interesting new music did you discover recently that I should check out? But my serious question would be, what's one intentional change that you have made in your own practices in the last year or two to bring them more in conformity with who you're trying to be?
Okay.
That's the kind of thing I'm always interested to learn from people, is what they're changing and why.
Thank you for that question. This has been an amazing time of learning for me, David, so thank you. Do you have anything else you'd like to say before we stop the recording?
The more the words, the less the meaning, it says in Proverbs, so I think I should probably quit while I might still be almost ahead.
Thank you, David, for your time.
Thank you for listening to the Cross-Cultural Psych podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you will join us next time.